I am Ollie Cowan. I am the communications manager for reputation management and misinformation at Sefton Council, which is a borough council in the northwest of England.
Obviously, Ollie, you were involved in the Southport response, which I know people will be aware of. But can you kind of give us a bit of an insight into the impact and the implications of what you had to face in dealing with that?
Yeah, obviously it's a well-versed subject. So I was one of the very or handful of officers that were sort of brought in or volunteered to help in those very early days, and those early days turned into about 18 months to 2 years. Um, I was the sole communications officer responsible for the local authorities' media presence, media response, public facing response. It was quite obviously, it sounds silly to say, to clarify, but it was incredibly challenging, especially in those early days because it was a massive multi-agency response that was required, and we had so many statutory duties and statutory requirements to communicate, to reassure, to try and foster resilience. And that was difficult from a number of angles and a number of approaches. It was difficult through very well publicized external factors, that sort of massive rise in misinformation that came from places like X and other forms of social media. A lot of that we now know is fostered by bots, but equally it was fostered by heavily localized misinformation from members of the public, people who I knew very well and probably would have assumed at the time that they were a bit smarter than they were, but they never were, which is absolutely fine. Um, those other challenges actually came from our partners,
Mhm.
and they know this, and I've spoken to them about to this at length. When you've got such a multi-agency, massive partner-led response to a tragedy that there is no handbook to follow, there is going to be that sort of clash, that difficulty in trying to sort of keep everybody on the same page. Very early on, our fantastic colleagues in Merseyside Police, because it was a criminal investigation and a criminal matter,
Mm.
took the lead. Now, they took the lead very well. I think on reflection, they probably wouldn't disagree with me that maybe they should have, a lot sooner than they did, allowed us to take some of the burden from them. They held on to that burden, which actually made it difficult for them, and it made it a lot more difficult for us because we had to follow their processes and their protocols, which is unusual. And because we are a local government organisation, we have politicians, we have cabinet members, we have
Mm.
spokespeople, we have people who are civic leaders. We have the top of the top civic leaders in the area, the people who are supposed to represent king and country. And they were told they couldn't speak, which you can completely understand because of the gravity of the situation.
Mm.
However, that left gaps, that left areas that were problematic, and people felt the need to speak. Unfortunately, because they were told not to speak and we couldn't let them speak, that pressure came back on us,
Yeah.
and that criticism came back on us, even though it wasn't necessarily our decision, and we probably wouldn't have, in hindsight, may have challenged that a little bit more at the time. Ultimately, did it really matter? Probably not, because when you put it in the face of things, what mattered were those people who
Mm.
were attacked and injured, and the people who were killed, and
Yeah.
the bereaved. That's what mattered ultimately. However, there was that challenge that
Mm.
befell us at Sefton Council to try and mitigate a very, very important criminal and multi-agency response with those statutory duties of community
Mm.
reassurance and resilience. They were the big challenges in those very early days.
And you are a local person.
I
Did
am, yes, for my
did
sins, a
can
local man.
can I ask, did that add anything in terms of, how
Absolutely.
you felt about managing that situation?
Absolutely. So I was, again, as I mentioned, the only real communications officer dealing with it directly, and I wasn't in Southport on that day, or I was very quickly made sure I got myself back
Mm.
to Southport, and I did feel a sense of sort of personal duty to help. This is, identify as my town, as my place, a place I have a lot of passion for, and not every sand grounder, as we're called, does have that same passion, but
Mm.
I certainly did, and there was a bit of a duty, an extra level. of importance. I couldn't log off at 5 o'clock, and I'm not saying anyone did.
Yeah.
I felt that, if I had to go to midnight, if I had to go to 1 a.m., if I had to go to 2 a.m. just to get people through, that's what I would do. And that is ultimately what I did. I don't take any credit for that whatsoever, but that is what I felt that was needed and that was necessary. That localized aspect, that fact that I am from the area, it added a lot of extra pressure because you could see everything firsthand. I also had access to information that a lot of other people didn't have. So it became very frustrating. And I would throw out challenge to people and say, well, actually, you're talking nonsense. You know what I do for a living, and I can tell you right now that's nonsense. So it did create fractures, it did create issues that probably wouldn't have been there for someone who was slightly stepped back. But ultimately, that played a massively beneficial part, where it allowed me to have a greater, deeper personal connection with those who were involved,
Yeah.
and they felt more comfortable talking to someone who they'd heard the name, they'd seen the face around. They went, oh well,
Yeah.
actually, that's the guy who sorts it out. I'm happy to talk to him, or I'm happy to talk to them. So it did work in the end, but ultimately, for those first couple of weeks, the amount of responsibilities I took on as a local lad as well as a communications
Mm.
officer were sort of beyond what you can probably sum up in words, certainly in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I definitely didn't make enough notes. I definitely did not take um, enough detail down. I am blessed with a very good memory, and I've since retrospectively started making those notes and going back through old emails and things that I'd sent to try and piece together a bit of a timeline. I would always say to anybody that that is the main thing, because equally you could be, we were never brought in on the inquiry. We
Yeah.
asked to be a core participant, but if we had have been, that information or some of that information that might have been asked of me would have just been, there would have been no
Yeah.
physical evidence to present as a bit of a backup for what I would be able to say. So certainly that's my key takeaway. My second takeaway is you can't be pedantic. You can't pick and choose when you want to, jump on and help people, and you can't pick and choose when you want to sign off. I remember receiving calls at 6 a.m. from people who were just sobbing and bereft, and had that deep personal connection and just needed help. And a lot of people who I was close to, and I'm close to still, at the time, I remember them saying to me, you know, that's not your job. Well, ultimately, that's another takeaway. It becomes your job. And ironically, yes, that is now my job, crisis media management. But at the time, the amount of stuff I had to do certainly was not in my job description. You can't be pedantic. You can't just go, well, actually,
Mm.
I'm just doing this out of the goodness of my own heart. Someone has to do it and get it done. You also can't. You can't take things personally. I definitely did at the beginning, and there was a couple of people I would have fallen out with, certainly in very senior levels of who would sort of levy criticism my way, and ultimately on reflection, they just didn't know where to funnel that criticism, and it was never
Yeah.
meant for me. But I was one of the people who got that criticism, and it was never deserved. So it's all, it sounds twee, but it is hard not to take things personally, especially with that personal connection.
Mm.
But that would be another thing I'd take away from that, to sort of try and keep a little bit of that, that iconic stiff upper lip. It is required in these situations. People are angry, people are upset, people are heartbroken. You can't take anything that's said to you, especially in those early days, personally. You have to let it wash over you and deal, because those people are going through it probably a hell of a lot more than you are. If you're involved in that kind of thing, I know I've said this before. It is that, find the people who are local, find the people who have that personal connection. It can be tough, and there are only, certain people will respond in completely different ways. But if you can tap into that pride of place, and that ability for people in your team or your wider team who will have that personal connection to the area where this has happened. It might
Mm.
not necessarily be personal to people who it's affected, but the area where that's happened, you need to use them. It may seem like you should do the opposite and you should sideline them because they are too close. certainly in those early days, closeness can help. It can cause problems, but it can help, but it can't cause more problems than the actual incident that's
Yeah.
happened ultimately. Um, Again, I would say take your sleep where you can. Don't worry about trying to remember what you had for dinner the night before because that's going to go well out of the window. And if you feel like you need to step away, absolutely make sure you step away, but make sure there's someone to step in for you. Um, and that person may not do what you think is the right job, and they might not do the job that you think you can do better, or you can do slightly differently with it, and you wouldn't do the same approach, but you will need them to do it regardless. They will need to help you out, and you need to rely on those people. So I certainly took on a lot myself. I probably should have welcomed more help.
Mm.
Sometimes that help came and that wasn't helpful at all, but you don't know until you try. And certainly my advice would be use all the help you can where you need it. If eventually you find out it's not necessary, don't be afraid to cut that out and say, brilliant, thanks so much for that so far, but I've got it and I'm taking it and running with it. So that would probably be the top things I would advise people to do. Um, yeah, frightening. It's something that you never expect to deal with. And I think there's there's certainly people will turn around and say, well, why didn't you do it this way? Why didn't you do it that
Mm.
way? With any major disaster, any traumatic event, there isn't a handbook. I could write a million comms plans and comms strategies. It goes out of the window, and ultimately let it go out of the window because that has to happen. I I'm very grateful, certainly for the amount of advice and professional support that I received by people like yourself, Amanda, Dr. Lucy Eastope, etc. That is massively important to rely on those people, the people who've lived and breathed it in the past. Everyone's got slightly different
Mm.
experiences, but they all add up to a huge learning exercise. So don't be afraid to take constructive criticism, advice, guidance from anybody. While every disaster and major trauma incident is completely different, there are very set, repeat things that will always happen. There will be those relationship breakdowns. There will be that sort of community desire to go above and beyond that you have to manage. We always see those repeat things. So it's massively beneficial that if you are in that situation, you take the advice and you're open to that guidance from people who have gone before you because people will go before you and people will go after you. And you can't take that with a pinch of salt. It's absolutely massively important.